All right. Well, as Karen mentioned, this is part two of a short mini-series of speeches that is accommodating it through for next month's code camp and whatever else other users wants to take it up. So, the first presentation was on just a basic overview of what cross-platform development is. And today we're going to be talking about deciding on a cross-platform mobile development framework. So, to recap on my previous speech, cross-platform mobile development is code that works on multiple mobile platforms. And if you all recall, I thoroughly convinced every single one of you that cross-platform mobile development is awesome. So, but if you should use native programming if you need all of the device's capabilities instead of part of it working in one phone and part of it working in the other. If you need the absolute utmost peak performance, really intense, really graphically challenging, whatever, and you have jobs that got their money in order to pay all these different development teams that do the exact same thing over and over again. So today's agenda is we're going to ever so briefly insult every one of these handful of popular flavors by talking about them for a minute, because that's all they serve, right? And we're going to explain just a couple of pros and cons of each, some of the things that a lot of people would kind of think about off the top of their head, and what really is important to a lot of decision makers. Then I'm going to give my advice on each, on when to use them and which one to use them. Of course, my advice is completely and totally inarguable. It is 100% obviously correct, and you should not do your own research because that would be wasting your time. Because I've done all for you, and I'm absolutely valid, right? So, obviously, I'm kidding. You should go ahead and do your own research and decide what's best for you. So, we're going to go over a handful of popular frameworks, why this popular is good, next to any other reason to decide on whichever framework to discuss, right? So, we're going to talk about PhoneGap, which we talked about previously a little bit, Xamarin, Accelerator, Corona, Chrome Mobile, and Mobile. Right, so PhoneGap. PhoneGap is a free open source framework, 100% free. You don't have to worry about paying for anything else, right? So that's super important. It allows you to build native apps for multiple platforms. Use native implementation, but anyway, it's built using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So that means you don't need to really necessarily know Java. You don't necessarily need to know Ruby. You don't necessarily need to know Objective-C. You don't necessarily need to know C#. You can literally build your app in HTML5, CSS, and JavaScript. And there's an API wrapper that will allow you to access each of the mobile device's components. So you can actually go ahead and use JavaScript calls to make calls to these individual device capabilities. PhoneGap cons, there are a lot, we'll talk about a few. The API support varies. Sometimes what you're trying to do might not work on Android, and sometimes a certain thing might not work on your iPhone, maybe some things don't work on your phone. So it's a little bit spotty, be careful. HTML, CSS, JavaScript, well that's good, but that's the only thing you can use. So if you think that's not good enough for your particular scenario, well, at least keep that in mind that you might need to have some servers somewhere to do the rest of the heavy lifting. You probably shouldn't be using it for extremely complicated apps, things like games, stuff like that, really high intensive stuff that has a lot of moving parts and things going on. I would say PhoneGap is best as a shell that connects to a web server that actually does all the real heavy lifting. If you want to do sort of like forms or kind of data entry, simpler stuff, but to be honest, that's a lot of that. Even things that look kind of nice. It really does, it can be a good fit for a lot of things. I don't mean to downgrade it though. I said native apps, that's kind of lying. They're not really native apps. It's kind of a joke. What they're doing is they take your HTML5 CSS3 JavaScript and they put it into a browser that is hosted on your machine. It's not really, but if you use things like jQuery Mobile or Sencha Touch, you can kind of make it look like it. So, Xamarin. Xamarin is C# code, and written in something called Xamarin Studio. You have things like C#, you get lambdas, generics, links. Most of the power of the latest and greatest versions of the C# development language. It actually compiles to true native code, so it's not some sort of a wrapper or anything like that. It's actual true native apps. It'll compile to Java for Android, Objective-C for iOS, and our reviews, C#, so those need to do anything as well. There are cheap and free options available, but as you become more of an enterprise, whatever, you have to start paying a little bit. But trust me, you can pay $200 for free developers. That's a lot cheaper than paying many, many, many tens of thousands of dollars per developer to for teams of developers to create your app. So honestly, it's pretty cost effective. So Xamarin Cons, limited UI sharing. So yeah, we're talking about writing code once and having it run on a bunch of stuff. Well, how come I don't get to share my user interface? So you don't totally write it for once. You do have to write separate UIs. But some people seem to think that's a good thing because the look and feel and the behavior of certain devices is look different from each other. So you might want to do something. You have to kind of keep this in mind when you're developing. You have to try to segment as much as you can that you can reuse, and then find the parts where you can't reuse it, and then optimize it so you only have to rewrite a little bit. Some people claim you get 80, 90% code reuse. If there's app overhead in each of the Xamarin applications, there's a little bit of overhead that gets added on because of the blended framework. Now they've been making a lot of inroads on this, and a lot of the Xamarin developers say this is very, very minimal, but it is something to think about. Your app will be a little bit. It's not free for businesses like PhoneGap is. Well, get over it. You're trying to make money. Pay a little bit. Come on. All right, so Titanium Accelerator. It's built using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, just like PhoneGap. Pretty awesome, right? And it actually compiles to a real app like Xamarin, unlike PhoneGap, right? So, best of both worlds so far. It reuses UIs, unlike Xamarin. Oh, geez, it's the same UI for everything. This is great. Best thing ever, right? End of conversation. We just use that all the time, right? And the native APIs are simplified. So when it's kind of like when PhoneGap says you have a call into the API, it makes things easier, just like Xamarin. There's also a free community edition, so when you're getting started, if you're an indie dev, you don't have to pay for this. Now here's an example of it simplified. So for example, Titanium UI show camera, and callback is meant to do call after the camera is shown. So I create sound, create map, and it says that doing this kind of thing in Objective C takes about 2,000 lines of code. Now, take that with a grain of salt, because that was said by the VP of Marketing 4 apps. I don't know. Gee, really? Man. So that was the thing that failed. So it says accelerated cons. Shared user interface, you're going to have a bad time. So the problem being that, yeah, sure, you can share your user interface, but the devices actually do operate differently. So when you try to write it in Titanium Accelerator, some things aren't going to work quite properly, and you're going to end up switching into a non-shared UI anyway. You're still going to be writing little bits and pieces that are specific to each individual device. It's not 100% shared, but it's good stuff. It's not free for businesses, but again, get over your training plan. So, Corona, Lab, SDK, whatever, somewhat optimized for heavy graphics. A lot of people use it for games. Good for games, flashy apps, that kind of thing, a lot of things going on. It does not support Windows devices right now. They are saying like, oh, come on, it's a big deal to support another framework or whatever. You just got to do it. You've been around a while, just do it. And it's written in Lua, which is one base, thus thoroughly, completely eliminating its user. One base. Here's conversation. Not really, I'm just kidding, but still, really stupid. I can't believe that's true, but whatever. So, Romo, HTML5, CSS3, JavaScript frontend, Ruby backend. It uses a specific MVC framework, which is a little odd, but if you're a Ruby developer, guess what? If you don't want to, or if you have a bunch of Ruby people working at your place, guess what? You don't need to hire new team of people. You already got this. So you got C# people, go ahead and bring in Xamarin. If you got front-end people, JavaScript guys, go ahead and use Titanium or PhoneGap, whatever makes sense for you. You got Ruby people, go ahead and use Romo. Must use specific MVC framework. The controllers are the ones that are written in Ruby, by the way. And they are bragging that they have at least 105 apps that are available for download. There could be 106 or even 107. That's crazy. So, another picture is gone. And Michaela, not impressed. Right, so, most things. C, C++ backend in Eclipse. So it's kind of interesting feature there. And you can use HTML5, CSS3, and JavaScript on the front end. You don't necessarily have to, but you can. It started in 2005, so very well established. Around for 8 years. A lot. older, a lot more established than a lot of the other ones. But and it also supports a lot supports a lot of outdated stuff. So I think that's really impressive. So you got these developers. There you go. Got yourself an option. All right. So here's a giant rubric. I actually tend to make this a lot bigger at the end of the day. I want to get all the way here and all the way down here. A few more things to think about in the longer presentation. But so let's see on the front end, phone gap, JavaScript, Xamarin Accelerator. You can HTML5 systems JavaScript kind of abbreviated. Corona, Lua, Pro Mobile, and we'll think all mainly JavaScript or at least capable of that. Back end, phone gap, there's just a plug right to the device. That accelerator, Xamarin back end C#. Corona doesn't have one. This is what it is. Pro Mobile, Ruby, as I mentioned, most of C++. So if you have people that have this particular skill set, you're in business, you're ready to go. Native, all of them are yes, except for PhoneGap. So remember that, which is a shell, a native shell browser that hosts an HTML5 web app. The support, everybody supports Android and iOS. And the phone, sorry, and for reference, I have all of their reference. So, in conclusion, plan very, very heavily. There's a lot more to discuss, but you need to plan heavily. Don't just say, even though it's a really good consideration to say, we got C# guys, let's go with Xamarin. I understand that's definitely a good way to start thinking. But plan heavily. Make sure you're doing the right thing. Make sure you're really doing your due diligence. Look at more than the things that I've discussed. There are definitely more options. And there's a lot of frameworks that are added on top to help you with things like push notifications, things like that. See if they integrate well with what you need to do for your particular app. And select the right framework, because if you go down the wrong path for a long time, you just waste your time. So try to save a lot of money by only developing once. And that'll turn back to the website.
All right, that concludes our speeches for today.